Hi. Hello. My name is Stephanie and welcome, or if you're coming back, welcome back. Either way, I'm glad you're here and I hope you're well. So last year I read my first Colleen Hoover book after being peer pressured by the Clock app and various friends alike. And that book was Verity by Colleen Hoover. I don't think I needed to say that, but which I did an overly long video on, but to give you the Cliff Notes version of everything, I thought Verity had a lot of potential, which was frustrating because there is a genuinely good thriller buried in there, in my opinion, with, again, some genuinely interesting things to say. It just gets bogged down by everything else. And my God, to put it simply, is there a lot of everything else. And when I decided to read one of her books last year being 2023, for those of you in the future, I put in for a bunch of them at the library, and Verity was the one that I ended up with. This, as you can see, was the very scientific method that I used to decide which one I was going to read based on all the recommendations that I got, including one that I forgot about until the hold came through at the very, very end of 2023. Like, I'm serious, I was reading this like leading up to New Year's Eve kind of a thing. And that was November 9 by Colleen Hoover. And like I said, there were a lot of things that I genuinely liked about Verity and I thought worked. So I decided, why not read another one of her books? Maybe I'll like this one better. As you can see from the title of this, that's not the way that went. And the way that went was off the freaking rails, which is what we're talking about today. So spoilers for November 9 by Colleen Hoover, and also content warning for body image issues, suicide, suicidal ideation. Emotional abuse is kind of the best way I can describe what happens. Stalking, substance abuse, misogyny, and gaslighting. It's one of those. Before we get too deep into the forest of red flags that is November 9, I'm going to talk about some technical stuff. And first and foremost, like Verity, this had potential. I genuinely like the concept, and I think it's a really cute idea for a romance novel, not this horror novel that's disguised as one. But again, we'll get to that. And I like the writing style. It's easy to engage with and makes for a fairly quick read. Pacing is decent, although in my opinion this book does feel overly long in places, especially at a little past the midway point. The dialogue is also really hit or miss. Some of it is fine, some of it is really, really good, and some of it kind of seems like it was written by aliens using an AI generator. That was kind of mean, but I stand by it. Most all the characters besides the main two are paper thin, but again, the main two are solid enough that it kind of balances itself out in a way, I guess. November 9 is also very trope heavy. Now, this isn't a bad thing and not necessarily a criticism, and again, some of these tropes are very, very well executed. And again, some of them are very much not. Ben, one of our main characters, is insufferable, but it works in a way to a degree. I genuinely enjoy an unlikable character, and to give credit where it's due, Colleen Hoover is really good at writing unlikable characters. That is until the absolutely deranged twist, but like I said, we'll get to that. And Fallon, our victim, our other main character, I said what I said, is probably the best part of this book. She's a genuinely interesting and compelling character, especially in the first half, and she's easily the best written character until the end, when it all goes straight to hell in a handbasket, as my grandmother used to say. To keep going back to Verity, but again, like with that book, the thing that is so disappointing about November 9, the twist aside, because in my opinion it's an absolutely book-ruining moment in its own can of worms that, believe me, I'm going to complain about for a significant amount of time later on, is that this genuinely had just so much potential. Like I said, I really like the concept of this book. It's just the execution that's an issue for me. So those are kind of my more technical thoughts on November 9 that can be boiled down to cool concept, poor execution. So let's get into the absolute train wreck of it all. So November 9 follows Fallon O'Neill and Ben Kessler, our two POV characters. Fallon is the daughter of a former TV star with whom she has an incredibly strained relationship, partially because he's incredibly self-absorbed and just kind of casually cruel to her. And to be blunt about it, he just kind of straight up sucks. And listen, I don't know if this sounds like I'm making a dig. I'm absolutely not, and I don't intend it that way. But Colleen Hoover, like I said, is really, really skilled at writing unlikable characters. She does it very, very well. Their relationship is also strained because when Fallon was 16 years old, 2 years ago, she's 18 when this book begins, she was spending the night at her father's house. Her parents are divorced, so, she split time between her mom's house and her dad's house. And she was spending the night at her father's house when a house fire broke out, and her father forgot she was spending the night, and he got himself out of the fire, but ended up leaving his daughter behind. Fallon obviously survived, but ended up with fourth-degree burns and pretty significant scarring on the entire left side of her body. I think over 30% of the left side of her body is burned, if I'm recalling correctly. And to say that this altered the entire trajectory of her life is an understatement. Not only did she almost die, spend months in recovery, is scarred both physically, mentally, and emotionally. It destroyed what little relationship she had with her father because, yeah, forgetting about your kid in a house fire would be a hell of a thing to try and come back from. And again, their relationship wasn't that great to begin with. Put a pin in that. Because I'm going to harp on that a little bit later. It also ended the beginning of her very promising acting career, as she was the star of what is described like, and I mean this with all love and light, know that, a CW-esque show about a teen girl detective. The show initially ended up going on hiatus while she was recovering, but they ended up recasting her because of her injuries, and eventually Fallon stopped acting altogether. Because of the, again, significant scarring she suffered as a result of surviving the house fire, Fallon really struggles with her self-esteem. She dresses in a way that's very, very conservative, to cover them, and even wears her hair in a way that covers the ones on her face. She also worries constantly that she's being stared at and that she's making people uncomfortable by simply existing. This is absolutely heartbreaking, right? And to go on a bit of a tangent, this particular plot point, Fallon's body issues are a very, very mixed bag. Given the ableist mess that was Verity, I was slightly very concerned about the way that a character who struggles with their body image was going to be handled. And I'm going to be honest, there are points in this book, actually, where Ben is involved, that it's not great to be polite about it and downright gross to be blunt about it. Again, that's one of the things that makes me so frustrated about November 9. It has its good moments, but then there's the rest. And my God, is the rest something else. When we meet her, Fallon is having dinner with her father on the titular November 9th, which is the anniversary of the fire. I want to emphasize that for later, right? Don't forget about that. November 9th is the anniversary of the fire that changed the entire trajectory of Fallon's life, to tell him about her plans to move to New York City and pursue Broadway acting, and her father is about as supportive as a brick wall. And he also drops the news that he's getting married again. This is the latest in a very long line of young wives that he has had throughout her life, to a woman that's only a few years older than Fallon herself, so dinner is not going great. And again, to give credit where it's due, this scene is well done. It's painfully uncomfortable to the point where I wanted to leave a dinner that I wasn't even at. Enter Ben, who was sitting at a nearby table and was eavesdropping. He overhears Fallon's dad make a really insensitive comment about her dating life, that she hasn't been on a date since the fire, which again, they're having dinner on the anniversary of, which he doesn't seem to realize. Right, like I said, he kind of sucks. Comes over and pretends to be Fallon's boyfriend who was running late and just kind of got stuck in, LA traffic, as we all do. And Fallon goes along with it because why not? And listen, I am an absolute sucker for this fake dating trope, okay? I love that, and I was absolutely here for this. And I kind of liked the meet cute of it all. This book kind of had me in points, I'm not gonna lie. And to be honest, I liked Ben in the beginning. I really did. Especially when he absolutely tears Fallon's dad a new one. I was here for that. And some of the one-liners in this part are pretty good. Like I said, this book has its moments. And thus, our love story begins. You can't see the sarcastic air quotes, but rest assured I am in fact making them. Because after her dad leaves, he storms off and makes kind of a really last horrible comment about her appearance and how she'll never be able to work as an actor. Like I said, he's awful. Ben and Fallon just kind of keep hanging out, during which we learn that Ben is a writer who attends college in LA, and apparently he is a very, very talented one, and they decide to spend the rest of Fallon's last night in LA together, as she's leaving for New York City in literally just a couple of hours. The travel mechanics in this book get a little weird, especially later on, but I'm not too nitpicky about that, and I'm willing to overlook it. So Fallon takes Ben home and even introduces him to her friend/roommate Amber and Amber's boyfriend Glenn while she finishes packing, and Ben makes them a reservation at a different restaurant, a more upscale one, and insists that Fallon needs to change. Thus we enter the forest of red flags that I mentioned earlier. So Ben picks out a dress for Fallon to wear to their reservation, and it's much more revealing than what she usually wears. Again, she usually dresses very conservatively to cover her scars because that's how she feels most comfortable, right? It was bought by her mom, who is never given a name throughout this entire book. Like, she is never ever given a name. I don't love that, right? But it was, she bought it for her daughter to help her feel more, confident, but Fallon has never ever felt comfortable wearing it. And she doesn't want to wear it because, again, she's not comfortable doing so. So naturally, Ben, of course, respects this boundary, and Fallon picks something else and they go to dinner. I'm just kidding. But I want you to wear this one. I shoved the dress back in him. I don't want to wear that. I want to wear this. No, he says, I'm paying for dinner, so I get to choose what to stare at while we eat. Then I'll pay for dinner and wear the dress I want to wear. Already that's, not great, to put it mildly. But before I talk about the rest of this scene, I want to talk about Ben again. So, like I said, Ben is our other POV character, so we spend a lot of time in his head, and his thoughts about Fallon are just creepy, to be blunt about it. He constantly sexualizes and infantilizes her, and even in Fallon's POV, he's incredibly emotionally manipulative. The latter is painted as him as being kind of a hopeless romantic, and the former is painted as being almost kind of funny. There's a lot of attempts at humor in this book, especially where Ben is involved, that come across as kind of childish at this point, right? Or maybe immature is a better word. And I'm not going to lie, like I said, I kind of liked Ben initially. He was kind of pushy, but overall seemed like a decent guy. Until we got to his POV, which again, he constantly sexualizes Fallon in ways that are gross and kind of weird, especially given what we learn about him later. But we'll get to that. So, back to the dress scene. Eventually, Ben seemingly gives in, until he proceeds to start gaslighting and shaming Fallon for her choice of wanting to cover up. And let me preface what I'm about to say by saying this. If you have scars or anything else like that and you want to cover them up, you should be able to do that without anybody giving you any kind of garbage for it. And same thing, if you don't want to cover up anything like that and want to, display them as they are, same thing. You should be able to do either of those things without anybody giving you any garbage for that, right? But Ben doesn't respect Fallon enough to respect that choice that she's making and says some extremely hurtful crap to her. Okay, he says, simply dropping the dress to the floor. Finally. But it's your own fault people feel uncomfortable looking at you. I don't even hide my gasp. It's the first thing he's said to me all day that's made me feel like I was being spoken to by my father. I'm not going to lie. It hurts. My throat feels like it's swelling shut, so I clear it. That wasn't very nice, I say quietly. Cried enough for one stupid anniversary. People don't feel comfortable when they look at you because of your scars, Fallon. They're uncomfortable because you make people feel like looking at you is wrong. And believe me, You're the type of person that people want to stare at. And you want to know what the absolutely worst part of all that is? The absolute worst part is that Fallon believes this absolute BS. Not only does she believe it, she very much does, she's grateful for him saying it to her. She's grateful. And now that we have entered this forest of red flags, it's all downhill from here, my parasocial besties. Fallon and Ben end up spending the night together in her apartment, literally, but not biblically, and they end up missing the reservation that they had. But once they wake up, they realize that their time together is rapidly running out. Again, Fallon is flying across the country in a few short hours. So they start discussing the future because they're starting to realize that there is some very mutual feelings between them, possibly. However, Fallon's unnamed mother, the first and again very long line of her father's wives, married and divorced him very young, so she always told her to wait until she was older before getting into a serious relationship, specifically until she was 23. I initially kind of liked the unnamed mom too. She made some points in the beginning. They decide to take the unnamed mom's advice, but with a twist. They're going to meet up every November 9th for the next 5 years until Fallon is 23. They're both 18 years old at this point. But they won't have any contact with each other until that November 9th meetup. So they block each other on all social media and don't exchange numbers. They also give each other things that they're supposed to do in that year. He wants Fallon to go on at least 5 dates because he's kind of obsessed with her, lack of a romantic life, and to go on at least one audition a week. And Fallon wants Ben to read some romance novels as he's going to be writing a novel about their November 9 meetups, kind of a fictionalized version of this love story. Put a pin in that. Put a pin in that comes back in a really horrible way later. And so Fallon and Ben part ways, and thus ends our very first November 9th. During this first meeting, Fallon and Ben meet up officially 3 times, which we're going to hit the broad strokes of because it's the 5th meetup where we truly lose the plot. But before we get to that, I want to talk about Fallon again. Because like I said, in my opinion, she was the best part of the book, at least in the first half. Now, the main plot of this book is, of course, the love story and the November 9th meetups. And because of that, and their arrangement not to have any contact until that meetup, we really only learn what they get up to in that year through them, which again, I really, really liked. I was here for the concept. I think it's cool. I really do. So, I think it kind of goes without saying, Fallon is deeply traumatized by the fire, and she is miserable in LA. And she's miserable in New York City too, which, in a better book, that was me and I stand by it though, it could have been a really compelling look about how just because you leave a place, you don't leave your trauma behind. You can't. You have to deal with it. Now, make no mistake, trauma fundamentally changes you. It literally rewrites your brain chemistry. There's no magically getting better, can't see the sarcastic air quotes, but they're there, from it. But there is learning to live with it. I always think of it like an open wound becoming a scar, if that makes sense. That's kind of dramatic, but I'm kind of dramatic, and that's how I think of it. It doesn't go away, but it becomes something you can live with. And there are pieces of that with Fallon and her story. The problem is that it's all tied back to Ben. Now, there is absolutely nothing wrong with finding comfort and support in your significant other, especially as you're working through something. The problem is that within the context of the novel, within November 9, Fallon is not allowed to have any positive development or growth that isn't tied to Ben. It's almost painted that she doesn't deserve that if Ben isn't there, which is a take. To be sure. I touched on it a little bit earlier, but there was a lot of ableism in the last Colleen Hoover book I read in Verity. When we meet Fallon and she describes her physical scars and her struggles with her self-esteem and body issues that are tied to those scars, like I said, I was more than a little concerned, and I think that concern was warranted. I talked about this a little bit earlier, where the dialogue in November 9 is a bit of a mixed bag. But it's not just the dialogue, it's kind of the book as a whole, in my opinion, that's a very mixed bag. Some of it works and works great, and then there's the rest. And Fallon and her trauma and the way that that is dealt with is very much in that boat. Some of it works and touches on some genuinely compelling concepts of healing and finding out who you are now after a traumatic event and learning to live with that trauma. And then there's the way that Ben treats her trauma. He gives her absolutely no agency or respect. And it's not just the dress bit. It's later he tells her that the female love interest in his fictional November 9 novel is going to have her scars, something he had not previously discussed with her. Again, who is obviously has, some pretty significant issues about that. And she's upset by this and begs him not to do it. And Ben physically grabs her, holds her in place, and covers her mouth to stop her from protesting, and proceeds again to gaslight and shame her for the feelings that she has. Feelings, again, about her own trauma that affect her in her everyday life and the way that she exists in the world. And again, she ends up agreeing with him, because Ben can never be wrong, and Fallon can never have any growth or self-realizations about herself and that trauma without Ben. And again, there's nothing wrong with having a significant other help you out with these things, but the way the novel paints it is that Fallon cannot have any growth or any healing without Ben. And then there's the way that and there's really no other way to word it, he almost seems to sexualize her scars, which again, I did not love. Okay, so Fallon, like I said, is a very, very mixed bag of a character. Put a pin on all that. Put a pin on all that I just said about her, because it all gets so much worse. Okay, tangent over. Now on to November 9, number 2. So a year later, on November 9th, Ben and Fallon again meet up at the restaurant where they met a year earlier. This is kind of their designated meeting spot. And so Ben takes Fallon home where she meets his family, including his 2 brothers, Ian and his oldest brother Kyle, as well as Kyle's fiancée Jordan. The latter actually recognizes Fallon from her teen detective show, and they kind of hit it off really well. I like Jordan. I wish she was more of an actual character than just kind of a plot device, but I liked her. Fallon hits it off really well with Ian and with Jordan. Kyle, who again is Ben's oldest brother, has a very different kind of reaction to meeting Fallon. Specifically, when he learns her name, when he learns that she is Fallon O'Neill. After which he tells Ben, very seriously that they need to talk away from everybody else. And Ben, kind of, puts on like a smile and is like, oh yeah, don't worry about it. We're just going to go talk. And while Fallon is looking around the house, she overhears them having a very heated argument that escalates. Again, she does not hear the argument. She just kind of hears the end and the escalation. I hear a loud thud come from the hallway. Worried it might be Jordan, I walk in that direction. I immediately pause when I see Ben pressed up against the wall with Kyle's arm against his throat. Are you an idiot? Kyle says through clenched teeth. Ben is looking at Kyle like he wants to kill him, but he isn't making an effort to fight back. Just as I'm about to rush down the hallway to pull Kyle off him, Ben catches sight of me out of the corner of his eye. Kyle then turns to see what's caught Ben's attention, and as soon as he sees me, he takes a step back, releasing Ben. I'm confused about what just happened. Kyle is standing between Ben and me, looking back and forth at us, and just when it looks as if he's about to turn and walk away, he spins around and decks Ben right in the eye, slamming him into the wall behind him. This commotion brings Jordan out too, and both she and Fallon are very confused and horrified by this, and Fallon can tell by Jordan's reaction that this is not something that typically happens in their house. Fallon is an only child. She grew up as an only child. She doesn't have siblings, but she knows that they fight. I'm one of 5. Sometimes our house was like Fight Club. But again, this doesn't seem like it's a typical sibling fight, and she can tell from Jordan's equally horrified and confused reaction that, this is not a normal thing that happens in their house. "Did you just hit him?" She being Jordan, says to Kyle. For a split second, Kyle looks ashamed, as if he wants to apologize. But then he blows out a quick breath and turns his attention to Ben. You deserved that, he says, backing out of the hallway. You effing deserved that. Understandably, Fallon and Ben end up leaving his house, and when she asks Ben what the hell was that, because, yeah, what the hell was that? He kind of brushes it off and doesn't really explain anything, and she just kind of accepts that, kind of too easily. In my opinion, because I simply would not have let that go, but that's just me. We don't really, at least at this point, get an explanation or any indication as to why Kyle reacted the way he did when we spend time in Ben's point of view, which doesn't make a lot of sense, but I get why it happens, for plot reasons. Now, we know that Ben has a connection to the November 9th date as well. But again, he never ever thinks about this, not even in his own point of view chapters. And again, I get why we had to do this for plot reasons. But there are points in this where that doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense. But again, sometimes for plot reasons, we just gotta let stuff like that go. Which Fallon does. She's lets that whole very bizarre incident go. Although she never ever forgets about it, right? And the second November 9 ends with Ben getting a spontaneous tattoo and then following Fallon onto her plane, where he tells her her homework, I guess, for the next year is to try and reconcile with her father. Brings us to November 9, number 3. And this time, Ben doesn't show up. And when Fallon finally gets in contact with him, she learns that Kyle was killed in a car accident literally 2 days earlier. So naturally, Fallon goes to be with him and comfort him, and the two sleep together again. Literally and biblically this time. And they decide that their feelings for each other have gotten too strong and they want to be together. So they're going to end the November 9th meetups and just simply be together. Ben is going to sell the house, which he has inherited, and is going to move to New York City to be with her. And they're very, very happy about this. Fallon is so happy that Ben is going to be coming with her, that they're going to finally be together. Until she learns that Jordan is pregnant, doesn't have anywhere else to go. So if Ben sells the house, Jordan will basically be left homeless, widowed, and pregnant. And not only that, she also learns that there's pretty significant interest in Ben's book that is based on their November 9th meetups, which she feels like if they stop the meetups that he won't be able to finish. Which doesn't make a lot of sense, because if he's as good of a writer as they keep telling us he is, then wouldn't he just be able to, write the rest of it? But I digress. And so she feels that, if he doesn't finish this book, then there goes his dreams, right? Rather than, have a conversation with Ben about any of this, because this is a romance novel, we got to have the miscommunication trope in here somewhere. I'm sorry, I don't like that trope very much. Fallon simply tells Ben that she has changed her mind and she wants to restart the November 9th meetups. And Ben, although is deeply saddened by this and kind of confused, they, again, don't have a conversation about any of this. They simply restart the November 9th meetups, and they're both kind of miserable about it. 4th November 9th, which is a weird sentence, but I digress, has moved back to LA. And the implication is that she has moved back to LA to be with Ben, and she intends to tell him that she wants to be together and end the meetups altogether. And then Ben shows up at their meetup at the restaurant with Jordan and Kyle's child, who he is helping raise. Not only is he helping raise this child, he is now dating Jordan, who again is his dead brother's wife. He is dating her and raising their child. This is messy, and I'm messy, so I was kind of living for this, right? Fallon is, of course, devastated by this and tells Ben that she was wrong to break things off last year and that she did want to be with him, but now she wants to end the meetups altogether and doesn't want to see him again and won't be meeting up with him next year. Ben, of course, chases after her, but she ends up leaving. That is their last official agreed upon November 9th meetup. But we still got a lot of book left to talk about. And that brings us to the 5th November 9th. And Fallon keeps her word. She is not going to meet up with Ben and instead goes out to the club with her friends Amber and Glenn. Remember them from the very, very beginning of all this? I'm going to be real with you, I didn't. As well as her kind of casual boyfriend Theodore, Teddy. that she's kind of been seeing off and on, but there's not really anything between them because she's still painfully in love with Ben. Also, she doesn't seem to like him very much, and neither do her friends. They go to the club, and who just happens to be there? It's Ben. That must be fate. Just kidding. We later find out that Glenn told him where they'd be. Ben comes up to their group, pretending to be a college student. He does not tell, Theodore that he knows Fallon. He comes up pretending to be a college student writing a paper about true love, right? That's his whole shtick that he uses to come up and talk to them. And eventually, Fallon and Ben, they end up, off on their own together. And Ben begs Fallon to talk with him, but he refuses, and he tells her, that he and Jordan have broken up, but that, they're still very, very close. He loves her like a sister, and he's he's still going to help her keep raising her kid, but that he only wants to be with Fallon, and he starts to get very physical with her. He starts touching her and kissing her very aggressively while begging her to come home with him. And Fallon refuses and eventually goes back to Theodore, and Ben follows and gives a very dramatic speech. Theodore, Ben says, interrupting him, "You seem like a nice guy." "Thanks," Theodore says, smiling. "Let me finish," Ben says, holding up a finger in warning, "because you're about to hate me." "I lied. I'm not writing a paper." He points at Glenn. "This guy told me earlier where to show up tonight so that I could find the girl that I'm supposed to spend the rest of my life with. And I'm sorry, but that girl just so happens to be your date. And I'm in love with her. Like, really in love with her. Crippling, debilitating, paralyzing love. So please accept my sincerest apologies because she's coming home with me tonight. I pray. I hope." Listen, I get that this is supposed to be like this grand romantic gesture. Besties, it's the way I would run screaming in the other direction. Eddie, who is written to be like an almost comical level jerk, I think he's written, so unlikable and so awfully that it comes across as being almost comedic because he's, meant to make Ben look good. When Fallon asks him, for time to process all that, he proceeds to dump her on the spot and call her ugly, which he rightfully gets punched in the face for. As he should. So Fallon and Ben are officially together. They are going to end the November 9th meetups and just be together. And the two go home to Ben's place and spend the night together, both literally and biblically. And things are going very, very well. They're both incredibly happy. Until the next morning when Fallon goes into Ben's closet to find something to wear, and instead finds his manuscript in the back of the closet. And she's initially just going to leave it there and wait for him to let her read it. But the thing is, even though she let it go, she's never forgotten about Kyle's reaction to meeting her. And it's always kind of bothered her, as it would. So she takes the manuscript and flips through it until she gets to that moment between Kyle and Ben. And her entire world falls apart. So this that I'm about to read you is an excerpt from Ben's novel, the fictionalized account of their November 9th meetups. And this is, the argument between him and Kyle that Fallon and Jordan kind of caught the end of. Kyle looks away, running his hands down his face in frustration. When he turns around again, I'm not prepared for what happens. He pushes me hard, and I slam into the wall behind me. His hands are pressed against my shoulders, and he's pinning me against the wall. Does she know, Ben? Does she have any idea that you're the one who started that fire? That you're the reason she almost died? I feel my jaw tighten. He can't do this. Not today, not to her. Shut up, I say through clenched teeth. Please. She's in the other room, for Christ's sake. I try to push him off me, but he shoves his arm against my throat. What kind of effed up situation did you get yourself in, Ben? Are you an idiot? Just as the question leaves his mouth, I see her walk around the corner. She stops short as she takes in the scene, and the shock that appears on her face reassures me that she didn't hear anything else. So Ben, according to Kyle, is the one that started the fire that almost killed her all those years ago. So this is a lot. It's a lot. And Fallon, like myself, is absolutely horrified by this. Because again, this fire changed the entire trajectory of her life. She nearly died. She was physically and emotionally scarred by it. It destroyed her relationship with her father and ended her very promising career and has affected her for years afterward, It affects the way she exists in the world. And at first, because this is a novel, it is a fictionalized version of their meeting. One initially hopes that this is fiction, that this is something that Ben just made up for drama, which is absolute weirdo behavior in its own right, but is not as bad as literal arson and then dating the victim of the aforementioned arson. So she flips back to the beginning of the novel and reads the prologue, where we learn that a 16-year-old Ben came home to find his mother after she had committed suicide. And this is devastating and traumatic. I think that goes without saying. And the day that she killed herself was November 9th. Just any November 9th. The same November 9th that the fire started. Another excerpt from Ben's novel. It seems so complicated when it's in fact very simple. Everything relates. Everything is connected. And it all begins on November 9th, 2 years before I came face to face with Fallon O'Neill for the very first time. November 9th, the first and last time my mother would die. November 9th, the night I intentionally set the fire that almost claimed the life of the girl who would one day save mine. An absolutely world-shattering revelation for Fallon, right? She is devastated and she is horrified because not only has Ben been lying to her for 4 years at this point, he did something utterly horrible and, in my opinion, unforgivable to her. It's vile and it's evil. And when Ben finally wakes up and sees her with the manuscript, he doesn't make any excuses and he doesn't deny it. He just begs her to let him explain. Fallon doesn't want to hear it. Not only that, she decides that she does not owe this weirdo anything, and she leaves Ben to stay away from her and to, never ever contact her again. And in a perfect world, this would be where the book would end, and also, Fallon gets a restraining order, therapy, and Ben goes to jail. But if that was the case, we wouldn't be sitting here now, would we? And that brings us to the 6th and final November 9th. Fallon fully intends on spending the night alone, kind of wallowing in her own misery, because she's understandably not coping well with all that. And it's actually mentioned that she got a restraining order against Ben, which good for her, as she should. But Ben will just not leave this poor freaking girl alone, as if he hadn't done enough to her. So he shows up at her apartment and leaves the manuscript at her door, complete with an incredibly emotionally manipulative note in which he begs her to read the manuscript so that she can understand, what he did, why he did it. And Fallon's better than me, because instead of just throwing the manuscript out the window, which I'm going to be real with you, would have been my first instinct, she leaves it on her kitchen table and just goes to bed and ends up sleeping for several hours. And while she's asleep, someone else reads it. Her mother, who came over to check on her after Amber texted her and mentioned that Fallon was having a tough time. She didn't tell anybody about what she learned about Ben, just that they broke up and, she's not taking it well. So her mom came over to check on her and she found the manuscript. What reaction were you expecting Fallon's mom to have upon reading this manuscript where this man confesses to, causing the fire that scarred your daughter, that almost killed her, and that, has left her severely traumatized, right? What reaction would you expect her to have? Anger, perhaps? Horror? Disgust? Would she be calling the police, maybe? Because she's holding a literal confession to a crime? Or are you expecting her to defend Ben, who again set the fire that almost killed her daughter? Which one were you expecting? Because I promise you it's not the one that you think. I'm not going to pretend that I know what you've gone through, but after reading those pages, I can assure you, oh my God, sorry, I'm trying not to be mean, that you aren't the only one who is scarred in that fire. Just because he chose not to show you his scars doesn't mean they don't exist. She picks up the box and sets it on my lap. Here they are. He put his scars on full display for you, and you need to show him the respect he showed you by not running away from them. Y'all, I hated that so much. Oh God, it makes me viscerally upset. Colleen, what the ever-loving hell was that? What the ever-loving hell was that? Literally, what the hell? And it only gets worse from here, believe it or not. So Fallon reads the manuscript and learns that after finding his mother dead, because again, 16-year-old Ben was the one who found her after she took her own life with a gun, he went through her phone and found out she'd been seeing someone. The person she had been seeing was Fallon's father. And throughout that Ben's mother was kind of, very, very sensitive, very emotional, and kind of a hopeless romantic. And I think that's why he immediately jumps to the conclusion that Fallon's father must have broken up with her and broke her heart. And that is what caused her to kill herself. So Fallon goes to Donovan. That's Fallon's dad's name, by the way. I can't remember if I said that earlier. His name's Donovan O'Neill. He goes to his house, and Donovan's not sad enough about what happened, in Ben's opinion. In Donovan's defense, he literally gets the news as Ben is watching him. But again, Ben is just so blinded by anger and grief that he sets Donovan's car on fire. Except he doesn't just burn the car. The fire starts to very rapidly spread, from the garage to the rest of the house. And Ben, freaks out and takes off and goes home, where he tells Kyle, his older brother, what he did. Sitting now at the kitchen table, Kyle hasn't said very many things, but the next thing he says terrifies me more than anything ever has terrified me in my life. Was anyone hurt, Ben? I want to shake my head no, but it won't move. My answer won't come, because I don't know. Of course no one was hurt. Donovan was awake. He would have gotten out in time. Right? So they switch on the news, which is talking about the house fire, and this is when they learn about Fallon and her being trapped in the house and ended up getting airlifted to a nearby hospital. And they end up watching all night, and, she thankfully, of course, does survive, but it's mentioned that she is significantly injured because of the fire. And Kyle immediately, with zero hesitation, starts helping Ben cover up what he did. He asks if anybody saw him. No one did, which kind of seems unrealistic that a former celebrity wouldn't have security cameras, but, plot reasons, we're going to let that go. He tells him to get rid of his clothes and to go to bed and to never, ever tell anybody what he did. Never to leave the slightest traceable connection to what happened tonight. Never look those people up online. Never drive by their house again. Stay away from anything that can trace you to them. And never, ever speak another word of this. Not to me, not to Ian, not to anyone. Do you hear me? Ben spends the next 2 years just kind of drowning in grief for his mother and guilt over what he did to Fallon, and her family, and actually starts, binge drinking pretty significantly to kind of deal with that. And this grief and guilt is made all the more worse when he finally reads his mother's suicide note and reads that she didn't kill herself because of Donovan O'Neill. She was recently diagnosed with terminal cancer and chose to take her life. So, he goes to visit his mother on the anniversary of her death, November 9th, and this is 2 years later, the day that he meets Fallon. And when he goes to his mother's grave, he sees that he's not the only person there, that Donovan is there. And he realizes that Donovan has been visiting her this whole time, and he's the one who's been leaving flowers at her grave, for the last 2 years, and realizes that, Donovan did care very much for his mother, which again makes the guilt so much worse. And so Ben ends up following him to the restaurant, and it doesn't explicitly say why Ben does this. I think the implication is that, he felt guilty and, maybe wanted to see if Donovan was doing okay or maybe was going to confess. I don't know. But he follows him to the restaurant and realizes that he's meeting up with Fallon. And when Ben sees how miserable she is and just how kind of awful Donovan is treating her, he decides to pretend to be her boyfriend and try to make her life better as some kind of weird attempt at atonement, I think. Go on a bit of a tangent about Donovan for a second. As soon as Fallon learns all this about him, she just immediately forgives him for forgetting about her in the house fire, right? He is just immediately absolved of any wrongdoing. And, admittedly, it was not his fault that the fire started. It was Ben's fault that the fire started. He still forgot about his kid in a house fire. And he doesn't seem like he was a great father before that, and he certainly has not been one after that. But, she just immediately forgives him, and they're going to repair his relationship. So he kind of gets a pass. Like, he's just immediately absolved of everything. Which is a choice. Do you want to know what the worst part about all this is? Do you want to know what the absolute worst part is? Not only do Ben and Fallon get back together and end up living happily ever after, because that is absolutely how this story ends. They get back together, and they live happily ever after. But not only that, Fallon apologizes to Ben. Fallon apologizes to Ben. This is kind of long, so apologies in advance. We're 16, she says, you had been through one of the worst things a child could ever experience. Your actions that night weren't because you're a bad person, Ben. I disagree. It was because you were a scared teenage boy, and sometimes people make mistakes. Yeah, mistakes, not arson. Sorry. You've carried so much guilt for what you did and for so long, and you can't ask for my forgiveness because there's nothing to forgive. If anything, I'm here for your forgiveness, Ben, because I know your heart, Ben, and your heart is only capable of love. I should have recognized that last year when I doubted you. I should have given you the chance to explain it then. If I had just listened to you, and then we could have avoided an entire year of heartache. So for that, I'm sorry. I am so sorry. And I hope you can forgive me. This is where our story ends, with the two of them again getting back together and living happily ever after. And this is one of the most horrible things that I think I've ever read. He caused the fire and then lied to her for 4 years. For 4 freaking years, on top of causing the freaking fire, during which he constantly shamed her and told her how to engage with the trauma that he caused her. Absolutely zero regard for where she was at in that process, or even what she wanted. Manipulated her emotionally, and yeah, while he had some horrible things happen to him, what happened to him is absolutely awful. That does not excuse what he did to her. Not in the slightest, right? Bad enough that, they get back together and, he's not only given forgiveness, but that it's, this grand romantic thing. To have the literal victim, to have Fallon apologize to Ben, makes me just, viscerally angry. This is horrendous. It's infuriating. This is a horror novel. It's not a love story. This is a horror story. So, final thoughts before I let you go. I genuinely like the premise of this book, and I think it's a fun and cool concept for a romance novel. That's not what this is, though. And the way that the book seems to bend over backwards to not only excuse what Ben did, but even romanticize a lot of his controlling and manipulative behavior, while not letting Fallon have even a moment or happiness or growth or even self-realization that's not tied to Ben. And again, it's almost painted that she doesn't deserve to have those things without him. And he has no respect or regard for the trauma that he caused her is weird and gross, and I hate it here. To be blunt about it, I kind of hated this book. All that being said, after having read 2 of Colleen Hoover's books at this point, I honestly kind of get the appeal. Because whether you love her books or you hate them, her books do numbers on TikTok. I talked about this a little bit in my Verity video, but it bears repeating here. Colleen Hoover has been writing books for over a decade, but it's really because, of the popularity that her books gained on TikTok that they have just, absolutely done numbers in terms of publishing. Like I said, love her or hate her, her books are incredibly popular and they sell very, very well. And after having read 2 of them, I honestly kind of get the appeal. They're good binge reads, the writing is easy to engage with, and the concepts are genuinely cool and interesting. And that's the thing, Colleen Hoover seems to be very, very good at setup and coming up with these concepts. The problem is the execution, where everything seems to fall apart. Again, one of the things that makes me so frustrated about November 9th is that it has its good moments. It genuinely does. And then there's the rest. And then there's the rest. And my God, is the rest truly something else, to say the least. So thank you so much for listening to all that. And until next time, stay healthy, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.